Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bump in the night. On tonight's episode, a woman on a vacation with her husband finds herself kidnapped. So, what would you do if you were taken from a hotel to be eaten?
Back in early August of last year, my husband Quarren and I went on vacation. We were going to do the tourist thing in one of the South's larger cities, but our trip was off to a rough start. We got stuck in baggage check-in for 2 hours. The self-check-in machines couldn't read our passports. When we finally got through, we got stuck in the security checkpoint and had to go through all our luggage. Because of all this, we missed our flight, and in turn, our connecting flight and a hotel transfer. We weren't pleased. After rebooking, we ended up with a total of 7 hours in delays before we got to the hotel somewhere around 11 in the evening. At that point, it turned out we'd been double booked. They were full. I was about to explode while Quarren looked ready to sink through the floor. Luckily, the hotel had a second location downtown. It was more modern, a bit more expensive, and overall nicer. As a courtesy for their mistake, we got a replacement suite. An upgrade. Finally, some good luck, right? Right. We took an Uber there. The place was practically brand new. They had this electronic system where you didn't get a key. You got a personalized code that worked on every door. Quarren handled the codes while I signed us in. There was a 24/7 bodega with organic snacks, wine, and drinks right by the lobby. A sushi restaurant that closed at 11. A sauna, a gym, an indoor pool, and a whole bunch of complimentary things. A couple of free robes to bring home, and a bottle of white wine with a little "for your inconvenience" note attached. While Quarren took a shower, I ordered us some food and unpacked. We'd been traveling all day, and all nearby restaurants were closed. As instructed, I included the code for the outer doors so they could drop the bag off by our door. We got our late dinner by the time I was halfway through a shower. Quarren delightedly shared how he was going to town on our order. Apparently, it was so good and barely any left. Bastard. They had included 2 extra orders of tiramisu as a little treat, but I couldn't eat it. It had coconut in it, my one allergy. All in all, that night turned out pretty good. We shared a lukewarm meal, watched The Office, and went to bed. We talked a bit about our plans for the next day, picking one thing each from our prep list. A tour of the local distillery, a museum trip, dinner at a steakhouse, the good stuff. So after a long day, we called it a night. But that's where the story starts. At 3 a.m., that same night, when someone opened our door. See, one thing I hadn't realized was that the code for the outside door was the same as for our room. It was a single personal code system. Quarren had been the one dealing with it, and I hadn't thought too much about it. But what I'd accidentally done when ordering food was to essentially hand a stranger a key to our room. And that stranger was coming through the door. I tried to shake Quarren awake, but he didn't react. He was completely out, to a point that it worried me. I could smell something sour on his breath. My mind wandered back to the order we'd gotten, and that extra portion of tiramisu. I hadn't had any, so he had chowed down on both. What if it had been laced with something? The door hinges creaked, and I didn't know what to do. I'm 5 feet 3 inches, unarmed, and in my underwear. I decided on a whim to pretend to sleep. If they were just there to steal, at least I'd be unharmed. They were expecting us to be asleep, so as long as I played along, I should be fine. I held Quarren, closed my eyes, and waited. Careful footsteps made their way across the hotel carpet. The door closed. A slow pacing back and forth next to our bed. I counted at least 2 people, maybe 3. Someone could have stayed by the door.
Just the guy.
A man whispered.
Bag him.
They were unwrapping plastic. They weren't in a rush. I could tell they'd done it before. They were quick about it. I held on to Quarren, debating in the back of my head what the hell I was supposed to do. I was leaning towards waiting for them to leave the room and then immediately run outside and get help. something shifted. One of the intruders made a hushing noise and waved the other one over.
What?
One of them whispered.
There.
Another answered.
The spoon.
Since Quarren was the only one who'd had the tiramisu, one of the spoons were left unused. Only one of us had taken the bait. They knew one of us was awake. In the next breath, I was grappled. A hand covered my mouth and another my throat. I was pulled out of bed before I even realized I was struggling. I opened my eyes to 3 dark figures. They were speaking over one another in a moment of panic. One of them saying they were screwed, another saying they should just go, and a third reminding them that they had no choice but to bring me. I got a gun pressed to the back of my neck.
One word, and you're done. Then we get him. Understand?
I did. I stayed quiet. I couldn't bear the thought of Quarren waking up without me, but what choice did I have?
Get dressed.
They demanded.
Now!
They brought me through the staff area, past the laundry room. There was only a skeleton crew working the hotel at night, and most of them were in the reception area. These 3 could walk me out the back like it was nothing. Right outside, they had an inconspicuous sedan marked with a fast food delivery service logo. They were still talking as they put me into the back seat. They had to improvise a bit. They were supposed to take Quarren, and he was supposed to be out cold. I was wide awake, trying my best to memorize details about the intruders and their vehicle. One of them took off his belt and tied it around my head as a makeshift blindfold. They couldn't drive around with masks on. That'd get them pulled over. They tried to camouflage my blindfold a bit with a trucker hat, and at a glance, you'd be excused for missing that it was a kidnapping.
Why'd you want to bring the guy?
One of them asked.
Less hair gets stuck in the drain.
The other mumbled.
More meat.
Sitting in the back of that car was surreal. All the familiar sounds of a calm drive. Braking, accelerating, the clicking of turn signals. But all the while, I felt the barrel of a gun poking into my side, right next to my heart. We were going pretty far out. There was at least a 40-minute ride, and we passed through a tunnel at some point. We must have used the highway. There were a lot of cars passing us. Then we went off-road. The road got rougher, and the sound of other cars faded. As we came to a stop, they all drew a collective sigh of relief.
Out. Now.
They put their masks back on and took off my belt blindfold. I only caught a brief glimpse of the outside area before they shoved me through the door. It was this large old industrial site, probably abandoned. There was a chain-linked fence lining the property. There were no lights on the outside, but the place had power. Stepping inside, the temperature dropped. Somewhere nearby, there were these large fans, creating a powerful draft that swept through the building. I couldn't see them, but even from the hallway, I could hear them. The place was close to freezing. I'd just thrown on my pants, a shirt, and shoes. I didn't even have socks on. One of the attackers went ahead while the other 2 stayed behind. We were in this long corridor with one door at each end, one leading outside and one leading further in. We stood there for a couple of minutes while I heard raised voices in the room up ahead. Those who stayed with me didn't say a word. They just looked straight ahead, keeping a gun aimed at me. Not a word. The door at the other end opened. The third attacker returned, now in the company of what looked like a woman. She had sunglasses and a white face mask and was dressed in what can best be described as dollar store doctor's scrubs. She seemed upset and was scolding the man in a foreign language. Not sure about the origin, possibly Southeast Asian. One of the 2 men holding me seemed frustrated. He grunted.
Hey,
He said.
what's the word?
I don't know.
The doctor woman groaned.
We always pick the man. So,
She scoffed.
could affect harvest. I don't know. Hormones.
She smacked something into the hands of the man next to her and turned to leave.
Prep her.
She called out as she hurried through the doors.
We try.
I was dragged into a big, open space. It looked like an old warehouse. The doctor was nowhere to be seen. She must have gone ahead. There were doors all over, and I was taken into what looked like a shower room. They proceeded to hold me down and shave my head, these long tufts of brown hair sinking into the drain. I hadn't had short hair since I was a kid. I felt naked. It just took them a couple of seconds. They were fast, practiced. They lead me to a pair of double doors. One of them checked a digital watch. Another opened and tested a padlock. There was a collection of buckets next to the door, stained by something thick and blue.
Time.
410?
410 or 411?
410.
Check.
They made a note on a piece of paper taped to the wall.
Should we tape her?
Doesn't matter.
The one with the padlock said matter-of-factly.
Been weeks. He's hungry.
And that was it. The doors swung open, and I was pushed inside. The doors slammed shut behind me, and I was on my own. The padlock clicked, and the chains tightened. I just stood there for a moment, not even beginning to understand what was going on. After a couple of minutes, I snapped out of it. I wasn't immediately dead, so there was time to map the space I'd been thrown in. I was in a corridor branching off in 3 different directions. I got the impression that this was built recently. The corridor was no wider than 8 feet and had been wallpapered. Even the ceiling. It had an uncomfortable swirling pattern, a combination of white, brown, and purple. I'd never seen anything like it before. The ground was covered in a thick gray carpet. There were small fluorescent lights above, giving off this eerie illusion that the pattern on the walls were coming out. Somewhere off in the distance, there was a rhythmic thumping. It was getting closer. Heavy footsteps approaching. I picked a direction and made a run for it. If you've never been chased by a predator, it is impossible to describe how it feels. It is, in a literal sense, dehumanizing. It makes you feel like less of a person. You become an animal, a thing, prey. You have to look at yourself and what you are, and what you can do in a completely new light. It forces you to come to terms with the most honest, primal version of yourself. It is horrifying. It brought to light how long it had been since I ran, and how impractical my shoes were. I ended up kicking them off, barely stopping. I went down one corridor, then another, then another. I rushed past a small room with what looked like a pile of pillows in the middle. It stunk of ammonia, so I decided to take another route. It was getting harder and harder to tell where that rhythmic thumping was coming from, and it felt like I was about run into something at every turn. Then I rounded a corner and saw someone. 2 people, a man and a woman, both dressed in bright blue wool-like turtlenecks. They had their arms firmly at their sides and stood shoulder to shoulder in a very unnatural and rigid manner, like 2 kids trying to hide something behind their backs. I stopped. For a moment, I thought I wasn't the only one locked in there. That maybe, just maybe, there were others. Maybe we could work together? Then I realized that the thumping had stopped. The moment I saw these 2, it was as if whatever was chasing me had stopped. The 2 of them lurched forward. It wasn't a step. It was like 2 mannequins being pushed. I turned to run as the thumping resumed. This time right behind me, I ran screaming. All your senses go into hyperfocus, and you get 100 thoughts running through your head at once. Whatever minute detail your eye accidentally latch onto is burned into your mind. To this day, I can recall the little things I noticed as I sprinted down the hall. Scratch marks breaking the pattern on the wallpaper, stains on the carpet, dark spatter on the ceiling. I ended up back at the room with the pillows. I decided to hide. Hurrying in, I realized it wasn't just a pillow room. This was some sort of lair. There was debris, branches, leaves, flowers, dirt. I dove right in and covered myself with as much as possible, ignoring the smell. I only had a couple of seconds. I was so panicked that I almost swallowed a flower petal. Some kind of dry blue sunflower. I held my breath and hoped. The thumping grew closer. Then it slowed to a tip-tap, clicking. From where I was hiding, I could barely see anything. I could kind of see the edge of a turtleneck sweater. Then something shifted. Now, I only saw the silhouette. But what I saw it didn't make sense. It was those two people I'd seen, but they were sort of moving. Their arms twisted in an unnatural angle, looking more like insect mandibles. Their heads bobbed back and forth like some kind of growth or tail. Their chests vibrated and stretched as they slowly came undone. They weren't two people. They were a single thing, pretending. Seconds later, something grabbed my leg. I was pulled out of the nest and dragged away at a violent speed. I flopped back and forth, slamming into the walls with every sharp turn. I broke 2 fingers by the second turn. I couldn't turn to see what had grabbed me, so I just tried to hold on to something. Anything. The carpet, the wallpaper, the walls, whatever I could. But the force was just too strong. There was no way. Then it stopped. I rolled over onto my back and came face to face with my attacker. And I didn't understand. To this day, I have a hard time describing it. There were so many moving parts. Segmented muscles, like living steel wires. Mandibles and a beak-like mouth. Patches of bright blue hair covering 4 extremities and part of a thorax. A pulsating abdomen. Something warm dripped onto my leg. Drool, perhaps, or a mild acid. It had the same color as the stains in the buckets I'd seen by the door leading into this place. It was a strange blue, and for some reason, that detail just sort of stuck. There were so many little movements at once, and I couldn't even get the scope of how big it really was. It seemed bigger than me, but it could just have long limbs. I couldn't make sense of it. It seemed insectoid, but its movement seemed calculated and intelligent. Then, pain. A bright, burning pain. I mentally blacked out. I flailed, spasmed, and kicked. It had me by the leg, and something sharp had pierced my thigh, picking at my flesh. I could feel my muscle pulling away from me. It was going to snap. I've never felt so vulnerable and exposed. To feel so mortal. It scars you in ways you can't understand, unless you've been there. Then it pulled back, letting me go. Mandibles moved, clicking, hissing. I'd never seen anything like this thing before, but I understood it. It was such a human motion, in a way. It didn't like me. I tasted bad. And that made it angry. It disappeared down the corridor. I just lay there, panting. I didn't even attempt to move. I knew it would hurt like nothing else had. A couple of minutes passed, I think. Maybe an hour. It was impossible to tell. In the distance, I could hear the rattle of the padlock. Perhaps my captors had heard my screams and figured that thing was done with me. Either way, they were coming in. But the moment I heard the door open, things took a sudden turn. Screams and shrieks, gunfire, thumping, popping, clicking, screeching. There was this one noise like a large rubber band snapping in two as a scream suddenly stopped. Panicked voices growing more distant. I sat up and used my arms and one good leg to scooch away. It took a long time, but it was the only way I could move. I didn't dare to look at my thigh, but I could tell it was bad. At least a 2-inch gash. I figured it hadn't hit an artery at least, or I would be dead already. The moment I could see the double doors, I realized something had gone very wrong. The door was covered in a massive splotch of blood, still dripping. Scooching my way out the door, I saw the aftermath of something. The floor was covered in blood and viscera, some which was still moving. I couldn't tell where one person began and the other ended. My hands got slippery as I scooched down the hall, inch by inch. There was still the occasional scream. Someone was being chased. Making my way through that room was a living nightmare. Every now and then I'd recognize something human, like a hand or piece of a leg. I just pushed through. I was doing the movement out of habit at that point. I couldn't have stopped even if I wanted to. A final scream came to a stop. All that was left was the sound of dripping, and me dragging my wounded leg across the floor. In the long corridor leading outside, I found a pile of torn fabric. I didn't want to look at it, but I could see a bit of denim in there. I recalled one of my attackers wearing jeans and decided to take a gamble. I had to feel my way through something I'm not even going to attempt to describe, but I found car keys. As I made my way outside, I managed to prop myself up against the door and limp. Something must have hit a nerve. I had trouble moving my foot. It didn't even hurt. It just didn't work properly. I made it all the way to their car. My hands were pale white from blood loss, and I couldn't stop shaking. Looking back, there was no trace of the thing they'd kept in there. I got in, locked the doors, and took a deep breath. Looking back, I noticed something by the entrance. The doctor. She was coming out of the building dripping with unspeakables. She seemed unharmed, but must have been in the thick of it. She could barely stand and seemed just haunted. An empty gun dropped from her hand. She looked my way, briefly, and then just wandered off. The word that comes to mind was defeated. Blank. I looked down for a second as I put the car in reverse. Looking back up, I saw that thing. It was standing by the entrance, again looking like two people in blue turtlenecks, stained with red. It looked my way, as if considering whether or not to allow me to leave. For a brief moment, it was quiet. We just looked at one another. Then it just closed the doors and retreated back inside. I managed to make it to a gas station. The owner called the police, and the rest is history. I don't think a lot of people read the articles about this. It was deemed as a drug-related gang thing, as the people involved were producing illicit substances. While I agree with this description to a point, I find it wildly misleading. Yes, that thing produced something. But what it was and what it was used for? God knows. I've talked to Quarren about this 1,000 times, but it's impossible to make others see and understand what happened that night. It was just a couple of hours, all in all, but it completely turned my life around for the worse. To this day, my one foot is a lot duller than the other, and I always double and triple check my locks. I made a lot of mistakes that night. I didn't know how the hotel codes worked. Maybe I didn't fight enough when they brought me outside. Maybe it was stupid trying to hide. Maybe this whole thing boils down to me having the worst luck in the world to encounter this, and the greatest luck in the world to survive it. Quarren claims I have some kind of PTSD. I don't think he's wrong, but I don't think that tells the whole story. See, sometimes I see these people in the distance that just looks off. Two people standing in a peculiar pose. One person and two kids standing deep inside an alley, only to be gone the next time you look. I'm sure some of it is just trauma creeping back to the surface. I'm sure it is. But not all of it.